Hello, everyone. Welcome to Informed Dissent, a news podcast that brings you dispatches from the gender culture war. I am Ben Appel, the author of Cis White Gay, The Making of a Gender Heretic. I'm here today with my one co-host, Jamie Reed, the gender clinic whistleblower and co-executive director of LGBT Courage Coalition. And today we are joined by Alex Byrne. Very excited to have him here. He's a professor of philosophy at MIT. He's the author of the 2023 book, Trouble with Gender, Sex Facts, Gender Fictions. And last Saturday, the Washington Post published Alex's op-ed in which he came out as one of the 9 co-authors of the HHS report on pediatric gender medicine. And he is married to the evolutionary biologist, Carol Hooven, who I'm sure a lot of listeners on this podcast know about and are familiar with her work. And what I thought was interesting too is, Alex, on your profile on your website, it says your main interests are philosophy of mind, especially perception, metaphysics, and then epistemology, especially self-knowledge. So I can understand why the gender issue, especially with philosophy of mind and epistemology and perception and self-knowledge, I can understand why this topic has really interested you and grabbed you. Before we get into that, Jamie has a couple news headlines that she wants to share.
Yeah, we just saw a couple pretty big developments in the world of sports this week. So yesterday, the Supreme Court has announced that they're going to put on their calendar 2 sports-related court challenges. It was out of Idaho and West Virginia, I believe. The date has not been set yet, but will be heard in the fall. This, I believe, is a pretty big, interesting development after Skirmetti. Would be really interested to see if, Kenji Brown Jackson is going to be able to define a woman now that we have a case regarding Title X and women's sports. And then also out of Penn State this week, we had a capitulation potentially from Penn State. They are addressing what occurred with Leah Thomas and their swim program, and I believe are still going to be part of a court hearing, though, regarding their Title X violation, but have basically said that they are going to reverse medals and moving forward will not be having men participate in women's sports in their programs. So 2 very interesting developments regarding sports this week.
It is. And also they said that they will be apologizing, I think, to all the women that were affected by it. Is that right?
Yeah.
I think the whole team.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, but that's definitely big news. Big news. All right.
So,
Alex,
Alex.
you're
Ben,
here.
Jamie, thanks so much for having me on.
Yeah. What do you want to start, Jamie?
Well, I don't want to fangirl, but I just also,
I need all the fangirling I can get. I mean, it's brought me a lot of
some
grief.
of our listeners, I think it would be really interesting for some of our listeners to just hear about how did you get to this point that you are writing, this amazing,
Should have stuck to.
like how just kind
Some
of
of my
walk us
colleagues,
through.
I think, wish I had stuck to the philosophy of mind and self-knowledge. Well, I think part of it, I mean, it goes back a long way because, as you mentioned, I'm married to Carol, and so sex and gender and testosterone and whatnot have been on my radar for a long time. And, for years, our son Griffin has been sick of the topic of sex and gender around the dining room table. Anyway, so that goes back a long time. And
Do you remember when she first kind of brought it up? Do you remember when she first maybe said, hey, there's a bunch of women injecting themselves with testosterone?
Well, I think around 2015, she was starting to experience some pushback, some related pushback when she was giving classes at Harvard.
And
And
just to give
so
background, fill in background here, Carol Hooven, it was the co-director of the undergraduate
that's
department
right.
of
Yeah, she was
evolutionary
the
biology at Harvard,
yeah,
right?
that's right.
Yeah.
That's right. And she taught a very popular class on behavioral endocrinology, and she was a much beloved teacher. She's a much better teacher than me, and she used to get these emails all the time from these spontaneous emails from students saying, "Oh my God, this was like the best class I've ever taken, and you're my favorite professor at Harvard," and so on. And she won all these teaching awards. So yeah, it's particularly unfortunate that she was eventually essentially driven out. I mean, she felt
Well, yeah, I mean
she
in
had to resign
2021,
because yeah. Anyway,
yeah. Well, and to get into
you
just
can
to
have Carol on to talk about
yeah, but it's
her,
relevant to
her
your story because I'm
cancellation,
sure
but
that this was a part of, getting you more
yeah,
involved in this
that's
topic
right.
because
That's
in
right.
2021, right, she was on television and she said that they on, in an interview that no, there are two sexes because there are two gametes. And then I think I read there was a huge backlash. I mean, I know this story,
I
but how
mean,
they
yeah,
phrased it by faculty and members of the student body, she got a lot, and then by January 2023, she left her position because she just had no support from the administration, she said.
yeah, that's right.
Yeah,
I mean, literally all she said, you can view that clip on YouTube. Literally all she said was, "Yeah, well, there are two sexes, but that doesn't stop us from respecting everyone's gender identity." It's like, I mean, I have said more controversial things than that. But
100%.
anyway, before all that happened, there was a famous cancellation in philosophy, which Jesse Singal wrote about, when a then junior philosopher called Rebecca Tuvell published this. I'm sure you've heard of it, this article about transracialism in the leading journal of feminist philosophy called Hypatia. That was in 2017. And of course, that was just after a few years after Caitlyn Jenner had come out on the cover of Vanity Fair. And then simultaneously, there was Rachel Dolezal, this white woman who was LARPing as a black woman. I think she was like the head of the NAACP in Spokane, Washington. I mean, she had all the sort of credentials. Um, she was married to a black man at one point, I think. Sort of grew up in this multiracial household. Taught Africana studies. Um, and of course, people couldn't help notice that these two cases were treated very differently. Um, you know, Rachel was widely derided and mocked, and Caitlin was cheered and celebrated. And Rebecca Tugel wrote an article not saying that, oh well, by parity of reasoning, Caitlyn Jenner should be mocked and disparaged, but rather by parity of reasoning, Rachel Dolezal should be accepted, at least in certain social contexts, as black, and transracialism is as legitimate as transsexualism. So that all sounded like we might have naively thought anyway that that sounds pretty progressive, and indeed Rebecca is very progressive, but it produced this huge backlash from her even more progressive colleagues, and she was the subject of this massive pile-on and letter writing campaign and the calls for her paper to be retracted and so on. She was a junior untenured philosopher. And yet all these senior feminist philosophers or people working in gender studies were giving her a huge amount of grief and abuse. And I was horrified by that. Lots of other people in philosophy were horrified by that. But that sort of pricked up my ears, and I thought, okay, why don't I just start looking at the philosophical literature on this topic? And then started to do that. And I thought, okay, I guess I think most of this is completely wrong. So I have a little contribution to make. So I started writing some stuff. I wrote a paper in 2020 called Are Women Adult Human Females? Which, believe it or not, is an extremely unpopular view in the philosophy of gender. And yeah, that didn't go down very well. And then, sort of simultaneously, while I was doing this, this philosopher in the UK, Kathleen Stock, was writing about sex and gender in the connection in connection with the then proposed reforms to the 2004 UK Gender Recognition Act, which would have ushered in a form of gender self-ID. That was later dropped, uh, due in no small part to the pushback of people like Kathleen. But she was subject to this more than 3 year long campaign of vilification by her professional colleagues in philosophy. I mean, I could like scarcely believe what was happening. And she resigned at the end of 2021. And by then I was thinking, well, what the hell? I simply have to keep going with this. And yes, then I ended up publishing the book, and the book isn't about pediatric gender medicine, but one thing leads to another, and these things are all connected. And I started to read more and more about the subject, and then I ended up publishing some stuff in the archives of sexual behavior, which is probably the world's leading sexology journal. One of those publications was on the evidence for the persistence of gender dysphoria through puberty. So I'm not like a pure philosopher anymore, even though philosophy is still very relevant to the issue of pediatric gender medicine. And I think I made some small philosophical contributions to the overall review.
Well, in your op-ed, you wrote that philosophy overlaps with medical ethics, and
Yeah, that's right.
when properly applied, increases understanding across the board. So tell us more about that.
Yeah,
Yeah, sure.
that was
So
my question too. Yeah.
yeah,
How,
so medical. So one good thing, uh, I think we were all very pleased with the way the review came out. I mean, we had very little time to do it. Obviously, I can't remember when did the executive order saying that HHS had to produce a
you had 90
review.
days.
Not right,
Yeah,
or
we had 90
93
days.
days
That's right.
before it
No,
was
we had 90
published.
days,
Yes.
but we only got going in like the middle of March.
Right.
So we
Oh,
had like
okay.
6 weeks.
Okay.
And there were 9 of us, and of course, all the relevant specialties, endocrinology, general medicine, evidence-based medicine methodology, um,
Psychiatry,
all of those
health
special.
policy, social
Yeah, that's
science.
right. Yeah, health
Mhm.
policy. All of those areas were represented by people with genuine expertise on the team. And we worked so hard for those 6 weeks. And you could tell what time. I mean, everything was remote, but we had lots of Zoom meetings, and we had many conversations over a messaging app. And you could tell what time people were getting up in the morning to
Hmm.
start work, namely very early. Um, and maybe this is just an indication of how critics, especially, didn't actually read the review, because when it was first published, so it had to be published on May the 1st. So we were like scrambling at the last minute to get everything together. And we didn't actually work directly for Health and Human Services. This isn't the way it's done. There's some intermediary who hires you, and then they own the report, and then they give it to HHS. Um, anyway, so we scrambled to get everything ready by the deadline. And when it was first published, there were like numerous like typos and missing references. Lots of citations in the text had no corresponding citation in the bibliography, and there were all sorts of like it was really quite embarrassing. Um, and so we worked. We were sort of. I think you often um, overestimate the intelligence and competence of the opposition, because we had kind of convinced ourselves that, like in a few days, someone would come out with this lengthy critique of the report, pointing out all these missing citations and typos and whatever. But like none of that happened. Like no one noticed. And so we
Because
spent the
they
next,
didn't read it.
yeah, that's right. No, they obviously
Okay,
didn't.
like
They
let's
obviously didn't read it. And so we spent the next 2 weeks again working extremely hard to like fix all these things. Like, there were like n numerous references of the form, you know, Smith 2000A and Smith 2000B, where, if Smith writes a paper Smith writes two papers in the year 2000, you call one of them A and the other one B. There were like many citations of that sort. But the A's and the B's were often mixed up, and by 2000A in the text, we really meant 2000B in the bibliography or whatever. It was like, it was really bad. But it all got fixed, and after that, 2 weeks of intensive work and a revised version of the document is the one on the website, and there's an errata page. We were quite open about um, the correction process. I mean, there weren't any like serious mistakes, but it certainly did give the impression of a somewhat sort of sloppy production. But that was because, we had 6 weeks and we had absolutely no extension.
okay. I know
Sorry,
you can't,
I've now slightly lost the thread, and I can't
no,
even
that's
remember
fine.
what your initial question was.
So I know you can't really go into who some of the other authors are, but did you find that the group, when it was put together, were you all just had been so into this, you were just all ready to write, or were there debates at the beginning?
Yeah.
How did the group kind of
So right,
coalesce?
right, right. No, that's an excellent question. I should say, like, f first of all, that given the executive order that like set things off, um, I think you might be reasonably worried about what sort of report would have been produced, because I think there are some, I mean, as it were, on our side, people who don't think much of gender affirming care, who are ideologues and who are also a little bit transphobic. And some of these are, doctors, and they could have been asked to write the review. Um, I mean, there was some like there was a lot of humor actually when we were writing the report. I mean, partly because, we felt we were all in this together, and it was like a very intense moment. Um, and yeah, one joke, unfortunately, it wasn't my joke, was that yeah, we should really call the report "Woke Child Castration Must Stop" or something. But so the you could sort of imagine the review being written in the um, with that sort of flavor, instead of a sober evidence-based review that doesn't overreach, that doesn't go beyond the evidence, that doesn't tailor its conclusions to the author's political convictions. And that was really like the main reason why I agreed to take part, because I thought the more I can do to help bring about a report with these qualities and to prevent a report being written that really does overreach or exaggerate or use inappropriate language or something like that, the better. Then, I'm just doing everyone, not least young people with gender dysphoria, a service. So anyway, so to address Jamie's question, yeah, of course, everyone um, on the team had been immersed for a long time in this literature from different perspectives, and bringing different specialties and areas of expertise to the topic. So there was kind of broad agreement on what the facts were at the start, but there was certainly no agreement when we started as to what exactly the review would contain, what the chapter structure would be. This was just like all up for grabs. So we had these like long meetings with, different versions of the table of contents being being proposed, and chapters were, in fact, the basic structure of the thing. I mean, if you look at the report as it is on the website, I think it's really nicely structured. It's a great resource for not just specialists, but for parents and families and interested members of the public. It's written in a fairly accessible style. Some of the sentences I would go back and rewrite, but as far as these things go, it's reasonably well written. But the overall structure of the thing, it just like fell into place only like a week or so, before we actually had to submit it. Chapters were constantly being rewritten and revised, and the order of things was being swapped around, and yeah, so but it all came out nicely, I thought.
It- Can you talk, are you able to talk about how the authors were chosen and who chose them?
No, I can't, except to say that there was obviously some adult in the room at Health and Human Services or the White House who knew their stuff,
Who was
and
plugged in, right?
who was plugged in, and who knew um, who the reliable people are, who the reliable, sensible, very well informed people are, and then some of those people contacted others, and yeah, including me.
So you're telling me
So
it wasn't
it's not as
Trump
if HHS didn't contact me directly, but
and Donald Trump didn't, you didn't get a call from Donald
some
Trump
entirely
saying,
sensible person did.
right. Yeah, the Trump family isn't, Donald Trump doesn't seem very plugged in or very,
I don't think Trump gives a crap about this. He just
right,
doesn't care.
right.
Yeah.
The one more question about that too, that kind of why was there no extension allowed? Like why was the dead? I mean, I know in the executive order he had said 90 days, but it was just like we have to get this done, otherwise this could keep going on
It
forever.
no, I don't think the idea of an extension ever came up. It just wasn't really on the
Okay,
table. The executive order said it's May 1, so it is May 1.
right.
Right. There is no, maybe when Trump says you have to do something by May 1, and like no one thinks of, no one dares to ask for it, for an extension, yeah, for fear of the consequences. But anyway, that was just obviously not an option.
So, one of the criticisms of the review itself was that it was done in this very short period of time, that it was, about 6 weeks, it sounds like, that you
Yeah.
had. And one of my, gut reactions when I saw that criticism was I felt like the authors have been preparing to write this in some way for years. Do you feel like you were do you feel like it was rushed and that criticism is valid, or do you feel like all of the authors were literally just sitting there having thought about this for a decade and just ready to put it together?
Yeah. Well, yeah, definitely the latter. I mean, that was another thing that we could, um, that people were reasonably worried about at the start, whether there really was enough time. But yeah, people had like written and thought about this extensively, and to a large extent, the review builds on the CAS review. So um, there's plenty of groundwork that's already been uh, laid down, and maybe more importantly, collectively, we were completely familiar with all the relevant literature. So obviously that was different in the case of Cass, she went out and talked to like 1,000 people or something. She commissioned these systematic reviews. We didn't commission any systematic reviews. We didn't go out and interview thousands of people. We didn't have to um, do literature searches because we already knew the literature. The one thing that we did do that was new, which I think had probably been in one form or another in the works for a while, is this massive overview of systematic reviews of the evidence, which takes up an extremely lengthy appendix, Appendix 4, which is a separate document. The results of Appendix 4 are summarized in, I think, chapter 6 or maybe chapter 5 of the review, but the appendix itself is extremely lengthy and has numerous tables and whatnot. That was in a way, that was the new, insofar as we produced any new research, that was it.
So I feel like the HHS report does dramatically you can see how it builds on Cass, but it takes this different route
Yeah, right, right.
that I mean, I have goosebumps right now thinking about the route that it takes in difference to Cass. And one of the things I think we should just most of our listeners are well aware that, Ben is a gay man, I'm a lesbian woman. Um, but the HHS report takes on the historical element of homosexuality and its overlap with trans, or it's
Yeah, right.
how it's so tied in with trans in a way that was so different from what I saw in Cass.
That's right. That's right. I mean, Cass does acknowledge, of course, that early onset gender dysphoria is strongly associated with subsequent same-sex attraction. But yeah, it's not played up anywhere near as much as it is in the review and in the ethical chapter 13. There's a bit about justice
Yes,
concerns
yes.
and um, the fact that the early onset contingent is um, quite likely to be gay comes up as a consideration.
Did you all like at a certain point, was there a conversation? Did you realize that you were steering or that this was moving in a direction that is, I think for a lot of Americans, hugely missing from the conversation?
Oh yeah, no, no, you're absolutely right. And I think, I mean, correct me if I'm wrong. I th I don't think this really comes up in the New York Times podcast, The Protocol. I know
Not at
you
all.
talked about that, but yeah, I mean, I listened to every one, and I was just trying to remember the other day. Is the whole same-sex attraction thing really mentioned? And I
Nope,
don't think
not at all.
it
The
is.
first the first
Yeah, of course.
episode. The first
Oh,
episode
okay.
they talk about how the Dutch clinicians were careful to filter out youth that were had internalized homophobia, confused by their sexuality, and were conflating the two.
I see.
And then I think they say something about autism as well. But it's like, okay, but then they never go on to explain that, well, 62 of the original 70 of the original cohort were same-sex attracted, so obviously that process didn't go very well. That was all they said about the overlap between these two things.
Yeah, no, and I mean, it is kind of funny, you might think, given that this report is, like it or not, associated with the Trump administration. It's
Crazy
like
times.
extremely pro, it is extremely pro-gay. It could be written by a bunch of gay activists. Someone had, some gay physician had a letter, I think, in the Wall Street Journal
Yes.
saying something to that effect that, yeah, this is where
Yeah.
finally they're putting their finger on
It was
the
probably
the
Roy Epen,
connection
I
with,
think,
yeah,
the
maybe finally they're
chronologist.
putting their
Yeah.
finger on the connection with homosexuality. I mean, one yeah, another way in which the gay connection comes up is in that early chapter, chapter 3, the one about the history of pediatric and adult gender medicine, when we're talking about Christine Jorgensen,
Mhm.
who seems to have been gay.
Possibly,
You
yeah.
know, yeah, I think that's very likely, at least to go by the biography of Jorgensen that we cite. But anyway, so Jorgensen's endocrinologist, this Dane called Christian Hamburger, um, received all these letters, like 756 letters, I think.
And being a good scientist, he analyzed them.
Yeah, right, right, exactly. Yeah. So after all the publicity following Jorgensen's surgery, yeah, he received all these letters, and as you say, Jamie, he analyzed them, and like predictably, his male correspondence um, were diverse as far as sexual orientation goes. There was certainly an over there seemed to be. I mean, the data uh, was quite incomplete because not everyone was forthcoming about their sexual orientation, but gay men were certainly overrepresented among his correspondence. But there were plenty of heterosexual men as well, which is just what you might expect. But in the case of the women, who were more generally more forthcoming about their sexual orientation than the men, he couldn't find a single heterosexual.
Mm-hmm.
No, they were all lesbians.
Yeah, yeah,
And when
yeah.
what just for listeners who might not know, when we're talking about Kristen Jorgensen, we're talking about the first major, publicized
That's right.
what
Yeah,
was called a sex change operation. This was, I think, in 1952. And Jorgensen was a American GI that went
yeah.
overseas
That's
to
right.
get
That's
this
right.
done, and then attracted a lot of attention because it was like this huge kind of unveiling, like the pre-Caitlyn Jenner cover of Vanity
Yeah,
Fair
yeah, yeah,
thing,
yeah.
you
I think
know?
it had it
And the
received
letters were
even
from people who
more
were like, "Oh, I
worldwide
want this
publicity
too."
than Caitlyn Jenner's coming out. Yeah, it was like it was a global story, and Christine was, yeah, like one of the f most famous people in the world for a time.
Yeah. And what happened to Christine?
Well, I think so. She was a celebrity for a long time. She was, by all accounts, she's supposed to be a rather difficult character. She had some personality flaws, and I think she died in 1989, and by then it was like all over, and like no one had heard of her. So her star faded a lot towards the end of her life.
If I'm remembering correctly, maybe Jamie, and this might be in the HHS report, but I believe that Christine was very unhappy with the results of the surgery ultimately, I believe, like in terms of how successful the reconstruction was.
I think that's right. I mean,
Yeah.
she had some kind of rudimentary vaginoplasty, which was very successful. But Jamie, maybe you know more.
Well, what I feel like I remembered more was also was there maybe substance abuse or
Mm.
misuse issues throughout
She was a heavy
Kristen's
drinker.
life. Yeah, was there, yeah. Was a heavy drinker.
Yeah.
Um, Going back to those letters, though, these were individuals who were asking Dr. Hamburger to also treat them. They were seeking these interventions. And yes, the cohort that reached out that were female were entirely same-sex attracted, were entirely
Yeah.
homosexual.
Yeah.
Did you did you all expect more of a reaction from this turn to address homosexuality? Was more or less, do you see, did it land the way you wanted it to?
Um, I think so. Um, I mean, there was um, of course, as you know, there was an editorial by or an opinion by the editorial board of the Washington Post, which was very complimentary about the review. So that was big. And yeah, I think the emphasis on the connection between um, gender dysphoria and and same-sex attraction. That was definitely picked up. It's also highly relevant to the chapter on psychotherapy and the complaint that psychotherapy is a kind of conversion therapy. So I think the way it's like totally understandable, but and in a way quite clever, but the way the activists sort of spin psychotherapy is, look, it is exactly like conversion therapy for sexual orientation. And that's because there's a very strong analogy between sexual orientation and gender identity. So everyone has a sexual orientation. Um, it's pretty much innate and fixed and it's very difficult to change it at the least, and changing it is almost certainly going to harm the person and cause them unnecessary psychological distress. And also, um, there's nothing wrong with having a sexual orientation which, in the gay case, is aligned with your biological sex. Some people have sexual orientations that are aligned with their biological sex. They're attracted to the same people of the same sex as themselves. And some people most of us, have sexual orientations that are misaligned. These people are attracted to people of the other sex, and there's nothing wrong with either one. And then there's supposed to be a complete parallel with gender identity, except that this time the ones with the wonky or mismatched gender identities happen to be in the minority. Everyone has a gender identity. For most people, it's aligned with their sex, or their sex assigned at birth, we should say. But for a small minority, it is not. And these are the transgender people. And just as in the gay case, the alignment or misalignment, neither is pathological. And just like sexual orientation, gender identity is innate and very resistant to change. And so that's why conversion therapy for gender identity or for gender dysphoria, sorry, that's why psychotherapy for um, for gender dysphoria, if the aim is, well, let's try and make this person more comfortable in their own body and avoid all these risky surgeries, that is exactly like a kind of psychotherapy for a gay man where maybe it's not going to work, but we'll try and make him more comfortable with, dating women and getting married to women and so on. Um, so if you have that picture, then it really does seem that, yeah, uh, psychotherapy for gender dysphoria is just as bad as psychotherapy for sexual attraction. It's unethical and it's not needed and it's a waste of time anyway, because you can't change someone's gender identity any more than you can change their sexual orientation. So I think that's where the complaint about conversion therapy comes from. It really only gets going if you buy all these claims about gender identity, which I don't think you should buy. Right? There really is, if you dig into it a little more, there is absolutely no parallel, that the whole thing just totally collapses.
I mean, first of all, I want to say just how major it is that you did this. For me, it was profound. I think for Jamie, it was too. Having this out there, this topic that we've been talking about for so long, or have been aware of since we first, well, Jamie has a little bit of a different trajectory than me, but when you first learn that kids are undergoing these treatments and so on, and kind of, seeing that connection so clearly and quickly, remembering your own childhood and so on, I remember like one of the first kind of publications that were even picking this idea up was like Leor Sapir at City Journal, like, and that's the Manhattan Institute. It's a conservative think tank that published it, so it's City Journal,
Yeah.
and here is, but it was so it meant so much. Then J.K. Rowling mentioned something. I think this was in 2021. And so to see the liberal press ignore this was so egregious, so frustrating and angering to so many gay and lesbian people. I know we are not alone.
Yeah.
And so to finally see that in this HHS report, and yeah, ironically, coming from the Trump administration, but then also, seeing your Washington Post op-ed, you say, the review squarely addresses an uncomfortable topic, the link between child onset gender dysphoria and same-sex attraction. The days of medicalizing same-sex attraction are supposed to be shameful history. The review suggests that the old days are back under the new guise of care for gender diverse youth. Quote, speaking for myself, the progressive embrace of this regressive practice is one of the great ironies of the modern age.
Right.
So to have that in a Washington Post op-ed is really
Yeah.
meaningful for a lot of
Yeah.
us, for a lot of people. I know it is for me. I just published an op-ed in Wall Street Journal, which was
All right. I
great
saw that.
with the
Yeah.
same, essentially saying the same thing. I think they titled it most quote, transgender kids grow up gay. But again, this is for a more conservative leaning newspaper. It's just such a different thing when you can see this in black and white in the Times or the Post.
Yeah. It's
It
also
gutted me
fascinating.
though.
Sorry, Jamie, go
I
on.
mean, Alex, like after reading that report, though, I mean, I was profoundly moved I mean, I wrote a piece called Homophobia on My Mind after that, at a
Yeah.
wedding, and I couldn't shake that through line of that same-sex attraction and that, yeah, it
Yeah.
had been what
Yeah.
we've been talking about
Right.
for so long.
Right. Um, yeah, let me make a couple of points. So first of all, yeah, about the strange bedfellows.
Yes.
Um, yeah, that is um, an unusual feature of this debate, and I mean it's particularly salient in the American context, which for some complicated reason um, is obviously very politically polarized on the issue of youth gender medicine. So it is generally a Republican, or at least a Republican Party, if not the actual membership, Republican Party versus Democratic Party thing. I mean, I think most Democrats, um, to go by polling, are highly skeptical of the medicalized pathway for minors, but that doesn't seem to be the view of the Democratic Party. Okay, so there's political polarization, but if you contrast that with my home country, the UK, it just shows you that there's nothing intrinsically politically left-right about this issue, and there certainly shouldn't be, because the left-wing Labour government, I think I mentioned this in the Washington Post piece, has embraced the caste review, and it looks like puberty blockers already banned outside research contexts, and probably the same is going to be the case for cross-sex hormones for minors. And the opposition in the UK largely came from left-leaning people, from left-wing feminists, Kathleen Stock is herself a lesbian and so on. And of
Hmm.
course, J.K. Rowling is very far from being on the right. Um, so yeah, that was the first thing, and then um, what was the second thing? Um,
Liberal press ignoring it. Maybe I was talking about your op-ed in the Post saying, I don't know.
yeah, no, okay, the second thing will maybe come to me
Well, it'll come
later.
to you. The in your op-ed too, you talk about how liberals were in the majority in terms of the
Oh,
9 folks
right.
that were
Yeah, that's right.
right.
Sorry, I was going to mention the other thing, which in a way is even more. You may be able to shed some light on this because it's in a way more puzzling or at least interesting than the political polarization. So it's true that, yeah, many gay people, gay men like yourself, um, are sort of outraged and think, yes, this is just back to the bad old days of medicalizing homosexuality. Andrew Sullivan, of course, is another great example. His piece, which I thought was terrific, came out in the New York Times the same day as my Washington Post piece. And yeah, okay, that's kind of what you might expect. But what's interesting is that you can find uh, same-sex attracted people, gay men in particular, very much on the other side. An example of that is the gender-affirming clinician Jack Turban,
Well, and you're saying
who's
how
very
is
much
that?
an evangelist for
Yes.
gender-affirming care. And I reviewed his book, Free to Be, Understanding Kids and Gender Identity, and pointed out, I mean, he'd taken the title from that old 1970s
Are we
thing.
sure?
Well, I don't know. It's a
Because
remarkable
I've listened
coincidence.
to that entire record, and my kids even still listen to it. There is no way he knew what he like.
Okay, well, it's an
I would.
amazing. It's just like an amazing coincidence. And yeah, I point, for someone. I mean, I'm relatively unusual in that I really have no like personal investment in this. So you obviously have a personal investment in it. And as soon as you start talking to people who are like steamed up on one side or the other, almost invariably you're going to find trans-identified child somewhere,
Yes.
or oh well, this would have been me if I had been, gay as I am, if I had been growing up these days or something. Um, but yeah, uh, I have no personal investment in this. Except that I am relatively old and I grew up in the 1970s and at that time like gender nonconformity was all the rage and we just didn't really think anything of it and yeah, whatever, okay. Men can dress up in this extremely feminine way if they want and grow their hair long and there was all this, fashion for unisex clothing and so on and this like emphasis on how great it wasn't quite put this way, but that the message was, well, if you're a tomboy, that's great. Girls can do anything. They can uh, be computer scientists or car mechanics, and boys can go into ballet and so on. And the another, so gender nonconformity, you would think, okay, well, obviously that's not like any kind of pathology. Obviously, that phrase, gender nonconformity, should not like appear in some, clinical practice guideline or some medical textbook or anything like that. But if I'm remembering correctly, the 2000 was it 2012 SOC 7 Standards of Care 7 actually had gender nonconforming in the title. And subsequently, uh, gender nonconforming got replaced by gender diverse. But it means exactly the same thing. So the gender diverse youth are the gender nonconforming youth. And it's just like completely explicit in WPATH literature and the standards of care that this group, which seems to be a somewhat maybe an overlapping group to the trans group, whatever that is, but it's certainly different. This group seems to be thought of as a group that needs its own special healthcare, like care for gender diverse youth. These people, it's like care for diabetic youth or something like that. These people need some special kind of medical treatment. If you like grew up in the 70s, you would think, what the fuck? How could anyone ever think this way? Maybe the trans people, whoever they are, maybe they have like special needs because, they're like wonky gender identities cause them to be distressed or something. Or I don't know. But the gender non-conforming group. What is wrong with them? Nothing. So it's very, very peculiar.
When you said you were bringing up like there's a lot of gays and lesbians who are angered by this, and then there are a lot who are all fully on
Yeah,
board, Jack Turpin being one of them. And I get that question a lot. Why do you think so many
yeah,
gay people are behind this? If they don't, if they, can they not see the connection? What is it? If this is such an issue, then why are so many gay people involved? I don't have a direct answer for that. I think that there are probably many, many answers. One of them that I've consistently said is, you know, I do think that a lot of gay people who felt very alienated from, let's say, their families or communities in the past, and then found a community in the gay community, are very afraid of being excommunicated from that community, kind of the only one that they've found a home in, and also feeling ashamed of some of yourself and your sexuality as if it was some kind of moral defect to feel. Well, I know for me personally, when I started getting into, equality and activism, I felt a very strong charge, like it was because I was on this righteous path, and feeling like I was bad and so terribly about myself for so long, and kind of having religious abuse as well, being able to kind of see where being around these people, this is the kind thing, these are the good people, this is the righteous thing, we're helping people, we're saving lives. And so to feel like you're kind of on this righteous path, I think it can be pretty seductive for a lot of people, and just draw or kind of keep people wound in. I don't know how common that is, but
yeah,
I think that might be part of it. The other
yeah,
one is, this past week, the New York Times published this article talking about gay. Glenna Goldis was mentioned in this article, and then people who it was about. Some gay people think, or some activists think, that same-sex marriage, and trans youth or trans medicine are the same sides, two sides of the same coin. And they were interviewing different activists and so on who had different perspectives about that. Obviously, Glenna Goldis, for people who are familiar with this podcast, writes very critically about trans medicine. Um, and then there were others, but there was one quote in there from a gay man who said, "It reminds me so much of when I would say that I was gay or felt different, and people didn't believe me. They said, 'Oh, you can change,' or 'This is a phase.'" He was like, they would say, "It's a phase, it's transitory. You'll move on from this." And he said, and so to have these kids not being believed and telling them that this is something that's just going to pass, that they don't know themselves. Obviously, it's not a solid argument at all. You could just tear it apart in 3 seconds, but it was kind of a window into at least this one individual's perspective, and who knows how many people might think that way as well.
right.
I, I'll just add, I also read Turbin's book. The primary endocrinologist that I worked with was also a gay man. In the gender center where I worked, we were primarily from the quote community, and that was something that we were chosen to be hired in part because of that. And I do think that in reading Turbin's book and the experiences I had with the clinician I worked with, um, these were gay men who were rejected by their parents in their family. I mean, Turbin wrote about the
Yeah,
violence that he
yeah. He had a homophobic
anticipated.
dad.
Right, the homophobic dad, the violence he anticipated. I think he even referenced that there was at one point a gun that might have been brandished regarding gay people. And I do think so many of the clinicians are attempting to do what they did not have in childhood, which was just, I'm going to accept this because I wasn't accepted. And I'm gonna be the champion of these kids because I didn't have that champion. Um, there was, you know, it does kind of go back to um, we had made so many strides and so many gains, and that article you're referencing, Ben, was about Oberfell and the anniversary of marriage. But that doesn't mean that those gains necessarily translated to these individual, young people growing up in a family with that intense homophobia or the internal homophobia or the religious homophobia,
Yeah.
that so many people still experienced.
Right.
It's still
Right.
very
I mean, it's
real. Go ahead.
well, on a slight tangent. It's interesting how issues about homosexuality and issues about trans stuff have been treated very, very differently in philosophy. So I remember when I first started at MIT in the 90s, a colleague of mine, a then colleague of mine who was gay, was writing articles in favor of same-sex marriage. And, this whole thing was treated within philosophy as, like a serious debate. You could argue against uh, gay marriage if you wanted to. And also, like back in the day, there was sort of philosophy anthology used by undergraduates, which is quite widely used, which contained a paper arguing that gay sex is immoral because it involves the misuse of your bodily parts. There's no need to get into any details, but I'm sure I'm sure you can imagine how it went. Um, and we would assign this and get undergraduates to read it, and like no one got like steamed up or something. This is philosophy. We can talk about whatever we like. Um, But when it comes to trans issues, like I just cannot exaggerate the amount of intolerance there is in the philosophical profession um, for defending views that are not authorized by the party. It's really quite extraordinary. The whole profession has been completely ruined over this issue.
I, I think I want to segue over to what led you to become the only named author or willing to be outed as the only named
Yeah.
author of the HHS report. So I'm going to read this quote. Alex is a professor of philosophy at MIT. This week, he outed himself as one of the authors of the review published last month by HHS, or rather, he outed himself after being hounded and exposed by demonic maniacs online.
Who wrote that?
Who is that from?
Um, so I found this as a tweet, but then it actually led back to, I believe, it was a New York Post op-ed about, and they went through how you were, I mean, you were outed online.
Okay,
And
yeah.
yeah,
Yeah, that's right.
so Florence Ashley, I believe it was, had posted over on Blue Sky or Twitter or somewhere, um, that they were able to download the HHS report and run it through some program where they were able to somehow find your name embedded in some part of the algorithm of how it was
Okay, I can clear all
Okay,
this up.
clear this up.
So first of all, maybe I should say that okay, now on this podcast, I can announce the full authorship of the report. It was me, Florence Ashley, and ChatGPT. We wrote all of this together. I mean, Florence obviously has to be some kind of gender critical plant. It's like so obvious. We quote her or them in the review,
That
going on
bitch.
about the
Florence's
body.
pronouns
That's
are
right.
actually that
Yeah.
bitch.
The body is a gendered art piece and so on. Florence's line is, yeah, look, whether gender affirming care is like efficacious or not, or whether it improves mental health is like totally irrelevant. It's like everyone, including children, should have access to it so they can experience gender euphoria and transform their body into a gendered art piece. But Florence and I actually have a little bit of history because it's related, in fact, to what I was just saying about philosophy. So Florence, even though she, they, I'm not totally clear what the pronouns are, is a uh, some kind of legal academic at the University of Alberta in Canada and has no philosophical expertise. Florence managed to get a paper on gender identity called "What Is It Like to Have gender identity published in one of the world's leading philosophy journals, which is Mind, which is produced in the UK. And that is just an indication of how the philosophy profession has been completely corrupted over this issue. Because obviously, what happened is, well, the reviewer or reviewers knew. You just have to read the thing. It's like totally it's clear who wrote it, and B, it's clear that um, some 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 trans person wrote it. And of course, you get this like free pass if if you have these qualifications, and the editors of the journal themselves just go on what the referees say, and if the referees are suitably enthusiastic, then well, whatever. You're just making life so much more difficult for yourself if you push back, even if you think the paper itself is crap. So it just gets accepted. And so I read this paper and I thought, oh my God, this is like one of the worst papers I've ever read. It's te terrible. And so I wrote a reply to it with a philosopher called Thomas Bogadas, who also writes on these issues. And we sent it to Mind, and it was like immediately rejected. It was obviously the reviewer was obviously on Florence's side. So that paper, that reply to Florence, ended up in the Journal of Controversial Ideas,
Mm.
where unfortunately most of my work on this topic has ended up. Um, and yeah, anyway, so we pointed out how bad the paper was, and yeah, there were various other flaws as well, including the fact that Florence made some claim and had a bunch of citations, but none of the citations supported the claim.
Mm.
This is absolutely typical um, for this sort of writing. But anyway, yeah. So um, when we were writing the review, we were doing it remotely, and it turned out, somewhat to my surprise, that I was one of the few people on the team with some competence in these newfangled things called word processors. You may have heard of them. Microsoft Word is one of the best known. So I had some heavy input into like formatting
So that's how your
and
footprint.
keeping the document and so on. Anyway, so we were extremely well, once we had collectively decided. I mean, this was some big decision. Not everyone agreed with it. Some of us were in favor of transparency, leading with our names. We absolutely we didn't have to keep our names off the report, but there were pros and cons. One was the peer review process. The other was the inevitable backlash that would ensue if our names were released. And another is that having the names there would have just misdirected attention away from where it really should have been directed, uh, namely at the actual content of the review. But as you were saying earlier, none of our critics read the thing anyway. But anyway, so we were like very worried about, making everything as secretive as possible and not giving any clues uh, um, to our participation. And I was, of course, aware that Word documents have author information in them, unless it's just like the click of a button to take out author information from a Word document. You can just permanently anonymize it. I was completely aware of that, and I think my name was like initially in the author field because of my word processing skills, the author field of the main document. I made sure to take that out when we submitted the PDFs to the intermediary organization who would then pass it on to Health and Human Services. But in the like last minute rush, I'd forgotten to do that for the technical Appendix 4. So my name was in the author field of the Word document to Appendix 4, and so it was transferred to the PDF when the Word document was created to a PDF. Now, what should have happened is that people should have scrutinized further people down the chain of command should have scrutinized the PDF. It's very, very easy to make sure there's no revealing information in the metadata. They did not do that. I think probably partly because it was such a rush job. And so my name was in the metadata of one of the PDFs. Now, you were just saying that, well, yeah, maybe these trans activists in programmer socks were using their sophisticated computer skills to, dig out my name buried deep in some, hidden layer of the document. And indeed, I think Florence said something like, yeah, well, if you open up this document in blah, 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 and do various things, then you can see Alex Byrne. But if you just open the PDF and just look at, in like Adobe Acrobat, and just look at, the document properties or something. It's my name. It's not like you don't need some PhD in computer science or anything.
Okay.
Anyone could have discovered it. It was like this was not some great technical feat. Um, so yeah, so that's how my name came out, and there are some other Alex Burns. One's a hairdresser, one is a deceased UK footballer. So it was pretty. I think one is an Australian librarian. Um, but there aren't very many, so it was clear that it was me. Anyway, that's how it all came out, and of course I discussed it with my colleagues on the team, and um, we decided just not to do anything, neither confirm nor deny it until we'd had more time to think about it, and maybe some suitable opportunity would present itself um, for me to confirm that I was an author. There just didn't seem to be any point in just like confirming
Mm.
these rumors straight away. Although, of course, I didn't deny them. Obviously, I didn't want to lie. And a non-denial is, of course, in effect, the very same thing as a confirmation. So everyone knew that I'd written it, and this is actually picked up on one of the main philosophy blogs. The guy who runs the blog posted about it, saying it was, if these rumors are true, it would be absolutely appalling.
Mm.
And there was some long discussion on his blog with some people defending me and other people saying, yeah, no, this is absolutely horrific.
When you say
I
that
mean,
the philosophy field has been captured or it's really bad, you are not exaggerating. Like this sounds.
no, it is not. It's actually not quite right to say that it has been captured, because I think the vast majority of philosophers, being philosophers, they're whether they have some particular opinion about this issue, they very much prize free expression and um, open discussion of controversial issues, and very much deplore the cancellation of people who have heterodox opinions. I mean,
Mhm.
there are various examples outside the gender field. There's a philosopher at Fredonia State University in New York, Stephen Kirshner, who's written all sorts of extremely controversial third rail papers on a bunch of topics. And
Just like the
kind of long
canon
story short, his
culture.
university basically tried to get rid of him and even went to the extent of basically closing the philosophy department down, so he would never
Mm.
come back. And I think there's some ongoing lawsuit. But anyway, philosophers generally are like extremely supportive of Kirshner. Peter Singer, actually one of the founders of the
Yeah.
Journal of Controversial Ideas, is another figure. He's written controversial things about disabled children, for example, which tend to get activists very much rolled up. And by and large, philosophers have his back, and that, to a large extent, is true in philosophy when it comes to issues of sex and gender. But it just so happens that um, the mainstream philosophers who work on sex and gender they are the ones with the extremely intolerant and censorious
Mm,
attitude.
mm, okay.
So that makes it unlike, say, Singer, who's, it's not as if the subdiscipline of ethics within philosophy is thinks Singer's work is beyond the pale and he shouldn't publish it and so on because it's just like so offensive or immoral. But in the case of sex and gender, leading philosophers who publish in this subdiscipline tend to be extremely intolerant of dissent.
Hmm. Do you think it was a good uh, decision to withhold the names, like in retrospect?
I mean, yeah, who it's
You still do,
yeah,
yeah.
it's very hard to say. Even with hindsight, it's just not clear. I mean, I was inclined to leading with our names just because, transparency
Hmm.
is really very important. And that was one criticism that was made of the Cass review. Of course, Cass had her name on it, but the people who helped her write the report were not listed.
But then
Um,
Cass even went on to, there was an article I read where she, now had private security when
well,
she
yeah, that's right. That's
moved.
right. And
I mean, so like,
some people were legitimately worried about backlash
Hmm.
and, or threats to themselves or even more importantly, their families. And, you have to take that kind of thing seriously. So that we certainly weighed that very heavily. We were either all going to come out or none of us were,
Hmm.
and we certainly didn't want to force some people who were worried about threats to their livelihood or threats to their loved ones' livelihood. But I suppose the names will come out eventually, although the entire review is out for peer review,
Hmm.
which will take a couple of months. There's like some complicated regulations about how government documents of this sort have to be subject to peer review, which I don't really understand. Oh, actually, one thing I should say is that this goes back to a much earlier point about it being a rush job and so on. As we were working, draft chapters were sent out to other experts for their comments. So there was some ongoing peer review when we were actually writing the thing. It
Hmm.
wasn't just the nine of us. We were obsessed with getting everything right. I'm sure the review contains a number of mistakes as is. That's like inevitable in a document of this size. I mean, even Cass, she had 4 years to do her review. That contains some errors, which I think they subsequently um, corrected. But yeah, there'll be peer review. I suppose that will be published, and then we will publish our response to the peer review. And
What I
um,
respect is I like that you actually gave me a really good idea today when I was looking at your website earlier because on your website you have a page with corrections for your book. Now, when I say corrections, I mean like, oh, I said this person was talking in New York or saying this in New York when they were
yeah,
actually in
yeah,
California or vice versa. So it's those kind of corrections like, oh, this was 2022, not whatever it was,
yeah,
very
yeah,
minor corrections, but I really respect that. I think it has a lot to do with the fact that you have an academic background and that details and clarity and everything is really important, especially in your field. But I think that transparency does help. For me, writing my book, I was so and have been so scrupulous and obsessed with like, oh my gosh, because it's such a heated topic.
yeah. That's right. That's
You're
right.
like, if
But
if we do, we could say, who knows anything. We could misspell one word and people will be like, oh, this is bogus, this is preposterous, this is ridiculous, it's obviously, bullshit.
yeah, 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 yeah,
So
yeah. And I
so
think it gives I think it gives the reader confidence that the
100%.
person really does care about the facts if you're up front about your mistakes. I have to say, this is one of her many um, commendable influences on me that I got the idea of having a corrections page from Carol because she
Hmm.
had a corrections page for her book on testosterone. I thought, oh yeah, this is a great idea.
Well, now
So
you both have
yeah,
passed it on to me because if that's the
yeah,
case, if there's some minor detail that I got, well, even though I checked over it a gazillion and one
yeah.
times, I'm
Yeah.
human.
No, it is amazing how you just after you've read it so many times, you just become completely blind to certain things.
Yes. You said earlier that you didn't want the story to be about who the authors were. So, that was part of the decision of why you remained anonymous, is that you wanted the report to speak for itself. I was critical of the decision in the beginning
yeah,
because
yeah,
I thought that it was kind of it actually became the story. Now, I guess
yeah,
news
yeah. I
outlets
mean, yeah,
and people were going to make anything the story.
yeah.
The names were on there, that would have been the story. If they're not, they are. But I mean, it was like so kind of ridiculous because even the Times fell for it, I believe. If I remember correctly, it was like in their headline about this, like HHS comes out with this report with no authors listed. And it's like, that's the story. Like how about we look at scrutinize, I mean, GLAD came out and you're talking about people not even reading it. GLAD and Trevor Project both issued these, vitriolic statements about it on the day that it was released. Now,
Yeah,
An
unless they
hour.
somehow got some
it's like
early
so
edition.
transparent that this is not based on reading the thing. But yeah,
Well,
you're absolutely right. I
yeah.
mean, whatever we had done, anything other than the content of the review would have been the story. And there are nine of us, and that's a lot of story. Like digging into the backgrounds of nine people. Of course, you can always find something bad to say about someone if you hunt long enough and spin hard enough. So yeah, that would have filled many pages. You could just like imagine an article
Yeah.
going through each of the nine authors and pointing out how terrible they are or something. And I have had some quite nasty things said about me on social media. I mean, I don't, you know, there's a bit of concept creep when it comes to the idea of a death threat. I wouldn't say that I've had any like serious death threats, but certainly there are lots of things on social media to the effect that yeah, I should really crawl off and die or kill myself or
And these are messages that are sent to you privately or they're posted on comments. Where do you see
I
them?
had I had a bunch of hate mail. I mean, not very much, but I did
Hmm.
have some hate mail when my name was first released, just by like
Hmm.
random people, and people would call my office phone and leave ranting messages on it. There wasn't all that much of that, but the crazies on Blue Sky are the ones who, if you like search for my name on Blue Sky, I'm sure you can find
Totally.
some quite obnoxious things. I try and ignore that. But we had I don't want to go into the details, but certain precautions were made
Hmm.
when it came to our safety and so on when we were writing the thing.
I do, Jamie, unless you have a really pressing question, I did come across and I think this is relevant to the topic because when we're talking about the connection between same-sex attraction and how why so many gays and lesbians are concerned, and we talk about a lot of gay people being involved in it, but I am inclined to believe, and I think a lot of other people are, that, you know, a lot of autogynephilic people are kind of the driving force behind this because it does really validate. I mean, Corey has written about this and talked about this. I have too. I don't know how Jamie feels about this in terms of the percentage of it or what the most, the most, but a lot of, I believe a lot of autogonophilic adults are very much behind and pushing the drive for pediatric trans medicine because it kind of vicariously validates their identity. If these kids were always trans, then it and then they were always girls as well. And there is this I wonder about a desire to vicariously live through these feminized young males. I mean, Corey has spoken about that. I came across a picture, and I want to ask you your opinion on it, about that topic. And then also, Michael Bailey just posted, uh,
Another picture, yeah.
yeah, that this I just came across this I think yesterday. It says these scholars just met in Toronto for 3 days to discuss the science and other issues related to autogynephilia. Articles will be written eventually. Now, Michael Bailey is the author of The Man Who Would Be Queen. He's the sexologist, I guess, is his title. Anyway, Alex,
Psycho
you're what is it?
Psychologist. He's
Psychologist, I'm
actually
sorry.
a psychologist.
Okay, psychologist. And a lot of obviously got totally he wrote the kind of a very helpful book and informative book. I love his book. Very sensitively written about the Blanchard's idea about the homosexual transsexual and the autogynephilic transsexual, but then he of course he got torn apart for it and there was a huge smear campaign. Alice Drager wrote a whole book about it. Anyway, what's your opinion about my hypothesis? And can you tell us about that conference? Or, I mean, what kind of you talked about and if there were anything really interesting
Oh,
things
right.
discussed?
Yeah, right. Yeah. So I was there as part of my my adventures in sexology. I read Mike Bailey's book a long time ago, more or less when it came out. I thought, oh my God, this is terrific. This is such great science writing. The whole book is absolutely gripping and it's like a fascinating topic. And then I just kind of ignored it for a while until it like came back full force when people in philosophy uh, were getting cancelled. And yeah, I think your hypothesis is really quite plausible. I mean, I would never have dreamt like years ago that I would end up at some conference with a bunch of sexologists where we talk about autogynephilia for 3 days. Well, at least, people often complain about the gender imbalance in academic conferences, and this conference was comprised of all men. But in this case, you can't really complain about the gender imbalance. Um, but yeah, it was absolutely fascinating. And I'd met Ray Blanchard before when I was doing the research for my book, and I'd talked to Mike a number of times, and I'd also talked to Paul Vasey.
And Ken Zucker.
But I hadn't, sorry, what?
And was Ken in the picture too?
Oh yeah, Ken. Yeah, sorry, right. And I'd already met Ken, and I mean, I knew him in any case through the stuff I published in the archives of sexual behavior. But it was great to meet all those guys and also Kevin Sue and James Morandini. Um, yeah, uh, it was a really terrific group, and yeah, maybe it's like the longest conference on autogynephilia that's ever taken place. Oh yeah, the really funny thing was it was in this Holiday Inn in Toronto, and it's right in the middle of Pride, and so there were these
Perfect.
Pride marches taking place, and you walk into the hotel, and it's just like festooned with the Progress Pride flag and, welcome to Toronto Pride and so on.
That's perfect.
So it was, yeah, and you could see some of these people we were talking about in the wild if you just stepped out of the hotel. Um, but yeah, so that was great. Oh, I also met it was barbecue round at Ray's house on one evening, and I met James Cantor, who I'd already
Mhm.
spoken to remotely when I was doing the research for the book. So it was really great
Did did the
to
topic
meet to
of
meet all these. I mean, they were like heroes of mine, basically. So
yeah,
when I first started reading about this, there was Mike's book, and then I guess I didn't really read anything of Blanchard's until much later, until I'd actually started working on academic papers about sex and gender. And I was just like completely blown away. I thought, oh my God, this work is he's such a great writer and he's straightforward, and there's like absolutely no bullshit, and we're just describing things how they are. And also, Ray is some kind of genius in sexology. I don't really know where he got it from, but the level of his insight is quite astounding. And it's, the ortogonophilia that example is just it's a kind of classic example of how much progress can be made just by, as it were, introducing a word for something.
Mm.
So, before Ray came along in the 1980s, there was kind of glimmerings of this classification. Well, more than glimmerings in the literature, dating back
Transvestism, I guess. Yeah.
to the century. Yeah, right. Transvestic fetishism and so on, and the various attempts at typologies of male transsexuality, some of which kind of closely approximated Ray's. But his great contribution was to unify this apparently disparate class of male transsexuals into one. And once you have the idea, then it's suddenly on the one hand, it's just obvious that there is such a thing
Right.
as ortogonophilia, and then even more importantly, um, you know, productive research questions become salient, and empirical inquiry becomes a lot more productive because now you're seeing things the right way. And what was this very confusing mess of seemingly disparate phenomena suddenly becomes unified, and experimental investigations start to suggest themselves. So it's a great example, really, in the sort of history of science, how you can make a lot of progress just by classifying things in the right way.
Did you talk about the trans-identified females and the possibility of,
No, we
autoandrophilia?
actually didn't talk about that.
Okay.
No, we didn't talk about that.
I'm curious where that goes. I've seen Michael
Yeah,
Bailey.
no, I'm curious as well. I mean, I think, it's very controversial.
Uh-huh.
So Phil Illey is a big proponent of autoandrophilia as an
Right.
explanation for some female transsexuality. Mike Bailey, I know, is very skeptical.
And if any listeners are not familiar with this, this is just it's in the weeds, or maybe not in the weeds for a lot of us. This is for front and center. We all know, but autoandrophilia, autogynephilia, look up autosexuality, look up Ray Blanchard. I'll have some links in the show notes just so you can read more. It's very, not difficult to get and understand. And I'm sure most listeners are familiar. Um,
Yeah, it's a fascinating topic. I mean, I should say that one purpose of eventually writing some lengthy article about ortogonophilia is actually to destigmatize it.
right.
It's used. I mean, obviously, some trans activists have done themselves absolutely no favors in this regard, but and as a result, ortogonophilia is often, wielded sometimes quite unfairly as a sort of club by the gender critical side. Trans women are just a bunch of perverted sex
Mhm.
fetishists who I don't think that's accurate at all. Although, of course, you can find some strange characters out there.
Did you talk about Hirschfeld at all? I mean,
Yeah, Hirschfeld came up.
just because when I read what was his book, it was like transvestitus,
Transvestites, yeah.
right? But yeah, so some German
Yeah, yeah,
title
yeah,
of that book that was what
yeah,
I guess
yeah, yeah.
late
He had some
19th.
autogynephiles in that book.
Oh yeah, I mean that was the funny thing, is that when I was reading these studies, I was like, oh, this is obviously AGP what he's
Yeah,
describing
yeah,
here. There
yeah,
wasn't a
that's right.
word for it. It's very interesting. Jamie, go ahead. I interrupted.
Oh no, I don't. I don't go into the AGP world.
Oh, you stay mom on the topic.
I stay mom.
Okay.
Interesting.
I mean, it is
Fascinating.
related to to pediatric medical transition because at the very least, you would expect a whole bunch of the so-called ROGD boys to be autogynephilic.
Uh-huh.
I mean, why on earth wouldn't they be?
Right. And also when it comes to the idea of this is the most frustrating thing to me is when we're talking about how the media, how, all of these scholars have framed trans as one single thing when there are various pathways to identifying as trans. I mean, historically, it would be kind of separated into like there's kind of really only like maybe two major ones. Now there's likely more, but the experiences of a gender non-conforming, gender dysphoric, gender distressed, gender diverse kid who will grow up to be gay or lesbian is very different from the experiences of the childhood experiences of autogynephilic people. And so
Yeah, that's right.
for
That's right.
people to discount this and think that Rachel Levine's story, who for all intents and purposes I would think is autogynephilic, has a or should have a say in the medical treatment of young kids. That's the thing for me that I can't. I think when I first read the kind of I read you read Bailey's book. I did read Bailey's book, but I read Alice's first, Alice Strager's book, Galileo's
Oh,
Middle
right,
Finger first,
Galileo.
and that was very, very helpful for me. Shout out to Alice because that was like 2018, I believe, and I was at Columbia at the time, and I felt insane because I'm this gay person who's like, holy crap, this is insane, and I'm terrified, and it was like oh, it was such a breath of fresh air because I'm like, I'm not crazy. And then also it was fascinating because I learned so much from that book, and then I really kind of went into that down that rabbit hole. But yeah, that's what really gets me is that topic. But
Yeah.
we'll skip away from this topic because Jamie is uncomfortable here. Alex, we
No,
do.
no, no. I will just add though, none of this was ever discussed within a pediatric gender center. There was
Yeah.
no recognition that there were
Yeah.
multiple
Yeah.
pathways in.
Yeah.
This was never,
Yeah.
ever.
I mean, this is a legitimate criticism that you can make of the Cass review. Now, as I recall, the word ortogonophilia does not appear in the HHS review, but we do cite we cite kind of in passing, I think at least one paper by Blanchard, and we do cite the Blanchard and Bailey piece, gender dysphoria is not one thing.
Yeah,
So it's
okay.
sort of in there, it's in there implicitly.
You're right. It's not in there. I'm looking now.
Yeah,
Oh,
but
I
if you
have
search for like Blanchard, it doesn't appear.
Blanchard's name is in there four times, and I think
Yeah,
probably
yeah,
just in citations, perhaps.
yeah.
Yeah.
That's right.
So
Yeah,
I do want to ask you, and maybe you don't really know a lot about this. I'm assuming you actually, I think you probably do, or have an opinion about it. But I've talked to your wife about this, right? And I didn't, but it was via text or email. So I want to talk to her about it personally, but okay, when we're talking about books that have been written about this, people talk about like how biological origins or reasons for possible biological reasons for homosexuality. I really connected with scientific literature. Simon LeVay wrote a book about
yeah.
this, like straight or gay, just in
Straight
terms of
gay and
just in
yeah,
terms of hormone exposure in utero and the possibility of like less testosterone exposure in males is kind of correlates with same-sex attraction or gender nonconformity in childhood, same-sex attraction in adulthood, if I'm right, and then higher testosterone exposure for females, vice versa. Am
yeah.
I
Although I think in the case of males, it's more. I mean, I think. Well, you'll have to ask uh, Carol, and right, no one should take what I say seriously.
okay?
But I think the best hypothesis is that it's not so much the amount; it's just the timing of the
Hormone
exposure.
Oh,
wash.
The timing, because the various critical periods in utero.
yes.
Uh, yeah.
Right. Okay, gotcha. I would love Carol to write or just say a very short piece about that. Because Jamie, you're familiar with that argument as well. I
Yeah.
mean, yeah. And so why we're talking about that is that why that's important is because, when I started learning about this and I was studying, gay history and studying gender at college, Columbia, and then working for GLAAD and all of these things and going and learning and researching and thinking about my own experience and how I always felt more like a girl when I was younger, quote unquote, felt more like a girl, whatever that means. But, really, I realized I had a moment in like 2017 when I realized, oh, there's not really much of a difference between me and like a homosexual transsexual because it's a very distinct possibility that we have similar kind of histories.
Oh, for
uh,
sure, yeah. Yeah,
it
for
just
sure.
from from birth, from being
Yeah.
in utero, prior to birth. So that's just such an important thing, and it was really helpful for me to learn and think about that and know about that.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's plausible that we could have successfully raised you. Actually, I think this goes for heterosexual boys as well, but we could have plausibly raised you as a girl, you know, given you hormones and so on, and some surgery, and then we'll like convince you that this treatment was essential to save your life or something, and you would have done fine. I mean, of course, you would have been sterile and whatnot, and had you know no doubt a bunch of other medical complications, but you could have lived your life out as a woman
I
and
remember getting that question.
been reasonably satisfied.
I was talking to someone and I said, this was years ago. I said, I'm just really concerned that maybe perhaps there are people who are kids who are being misdiagnosed or diagnostic overshadowing, especially when it comes to, homosexuality. I feel like I was saying to this person, you remember me as a kid. And they were like, yeah, absolutely. And she said, but you don't think you would be happy as a trans woman? And I
Yeah.
was like, well, like as if it was just like, sliding doors, like that Gwyneth Paltrow
Yeah.
movie, like, oh, this way or that way. Um, so interesting to me that response because I thought, well, that would be quite a different experience
Let me
to
just
have,
get the cat. Excuse me.
yeah, to
Right.
have a lifetime of medicalization and sterilization and so on, and living my life as something that I'm not and oh, look at this
Yeah.
cat. Oh my God. Who is that? What's the
Sorry,
name?
Lola. She was just mewling outside the door.
Oh, she's beautiful.
Um,
Anyway,
Um,
we've kept you for a while.
yes,
We
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 should do our non-gender
we have
thing.
we have a tradition. You might be familiar, Alex, but we do like to say or recommend one non-gender related thing to the audience, each of us. If you have anything that you can think of, we can go first. But if there's a book or a movie or activity or something you're appreciating or thinking about right now, we can say that. For mine, I'll go first. It's an easy one, Wimbledon. I'm a tennis fan,
God.
and so I like watching these tournaments, and that started this past week. So I'm very caught
Wait,
up in that.
have we been recording this podcast a whole solid year? Or was that a different tennis tournament
The
the
different
last time?
tennis tournament. There's like four majors throughout the year, so that's what I was talking about previously. Um, yes. So that's mine. Jamie, do you have one?
Yes. Well, I've got a bunch of books out of the library this week about gardening off season and pickling. And so um I harvested about 6 cucumbers this week. So I'm gonna make pickles over the weekend. And that's my continuing through line, trend for me right now is gardening. That's my
oh,
non-gender
that's
thing.
lovely. No, I like gardening. I
Yes.
have a fish pond
Really?
in my garden, yeah, with plenty of fish. So I can thoroughly recommend fish ponds. I was going to say that, yeah, I think of stuff on TV, everyone should watch like, I guess it was the last series of White Lotus, but that is not um, completely unconnected with the
Non-gendered.
present
There was
topic because there's a great
yes.
autogynephilia scene in it. And indeed,
Yes.
someone played that autogynephilia scene at the AGP the AGP conference.
Uh,
I've
Um,
actually watched every season of White Lotus.
oh,
yeah,
They're
me
no,
too.
that's absolutely
Excellent.
terrific. There's also another detective series from the UK called Department Q, which
I
Carol and I just started
that
watching.
was one of my weeks before.
Yeah.
Did you watch it all?
No, no, no. I think
Oh,
Carol is less into it than I am.
oh, it's so good.
Yeah.
Well, this will
Okay,
be the
well,
second time
yeah,
I'm linking
it's
to it
in
in
it's
show
in
Yes,
there.
notes.
yes, it was very good. I love British crime.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay.
Wonderful.
You're in the
Okay,
club.
well, thanks so much.
You like the same TV shows.
Well, I don't know, growing up in Britain, somehow, Britain, Britain is not a country that's riddled with crime, but somehow we are obsessed with crime. And, the British crime novel. I used to read these Agatha Christie novels when I was growing up, and there are some awesome British TV series. Sorry, we're getting a bit off track, but did you ever see Inspector Morse?
Yes.
Oh yeah, that is terrific. That is
Yes.
really, really good.
Okay.
So yeah, maybe it's the absence of crime that makes us so obsessed with murder mysteries and so on. But
Well,
Yeah, you're good though. Okay.
we're our
That's
pl
it.
I'm gonna reach out to Carol, your wife, because I do really want her to come on as well. And so please drop that in,
I
put that in
will.
her
All right.
mind
Yeah.
if you can this weekend. You should go. You should go. But I'm sure she would probably be willing to at some point. I know she's really busy, but she's amazing. I love her. So Alex, you've been awesome. Thank you, and for all the work you do, for everything you do. Very much appreciated, and thank you for joining us today. This was really, really great.
Ben, Jamie, it was an absolute honor to be on. Thanks so much.
Great. All right.
Thanks.
Have a great week, everyone.
Okay.
Bye.